Do you struggle getting your blood sugar down and keeping it down consistently and want to know some practical tips that can help you do this? Well, in this video, I'll share 25 blood sugar lowering tips from 2024 and tips that I personally have used on a day-to-day basis to keep my blood sugars level consistently. Not just last year, but for the past 6 years. I've kept my A1C in the low 6s and high 5s. I do totally respect that everybody's diabetes is completely different and individual. This is not medical advice. It's me sharing my 42 years of living with type 1 diabetes, raising 2 type 1 kids, and working in the field of diabetes education off and on. And I'm constantly trying to figure out better ways to manage my diabetes, keep my blood sugars level, and improve my health. Before we jump in, I want to share that tip number 10 might come as a bit of a shock to you, especially if you carb count. Stay tuned for that one. And tip number 25, the very last tip, is a link between this chemical and diabetes that really hasn't been explored. But I'm convinced that by targeting this one and investigating it, which I'm planning to do, will impact my diabetes control and make it even better. Stay tuned for that one. All right, well, let's dive in. Tip number 1 is pre-bolusing for your insulin dose. Meaning, what I do is I take my insulin and then I set a timer for 20 minutes if it's an overrapid. The reason for that is if you take your insulin dose, start eating right away, the insulin's not quick enough to manage the blood sugar spike from the food that you're eating. By doing this, I've lowered my A1C by 0.5 to 1%, but I personally practice this religiously. Tip number 2, I use the insulin pump when I have an unpredictable type of schedule. I use it when I'm on holidays or have really unpredictable eating patterns and sleeping patterns because the pump does a lot of the work in the background for you. That's my use of the pump. Tip number 3 is kind of the opposite. I go off the pump and use multiple daily doses of insulin because my life is very, very structured. I have a Monday to Friday job. I don't work shift work. I eat very similar types of foods most days. It's really easy for me to do that. Not to mention, I don't mind poking myself with needles. Like I said, it's my journey and everybody's style of diabetes management is different. I say do what works for you, but my tip is if you find out what works for you, which I've done, and it can lead to really, really stable blood sugars, which as you can see here, my A1C has been down for many years now. Tip number 4, be aware of Insulin On Board. And when I went back on my pump, because I was off it for many years, I realized that Insulin On Board is a principle that I kind of forgot about using and thinking about. Prevents me from doing is stacking insulin. Now, stacking insulin is when you eat frequently many times in like a 4-hour period of time, for example. You take a bolus for your first bolus to start eating, and then you take another one, and then another one, and another one. Now, the insulin pump's brilliant because it actually figures out how much insulin's on board before it tells you how much insulin it recommends you take. When you're not on a pump, you have to do that mental calculation yourself. Tip number 5, don't trust your CGM. Now that sounds absolutely terrible. When you first put your CGM in, it's often wrong for many reasons. Inflammation of the skin, but if you don't feel a certain way that your continuous glucose monitor is telling you, then confirm with a glucometer check, a finger stick check. And that's something I've done quite a bit this year versus just trusting the CGM when I put it in. Don't trust your CGM all the time. Tip number 6, if you're making treatment decisions based on your CGM, it lies to you sometimes. And what I mean by that is you may look at it and a continuous glucose monitor will give you an arrow up, an arrow sideways, an arrow down. Those arrows are kind of alarming if you're not used to the device and you don't have knowledge about Insulin On Board and all these other things, but don't overreact. Now, when I look at that, I think about all these things. I'm like, well, what food do I have on board? Did I eat a really high glycemic type food that could cause my sugar to go double arrow up? And will the insulin catch up later and bring it down? Because what sometimes happens is you get that 2 double arrow up, and then I've done this a lot actually, and I'll freak out. And I'm like, oh no, I don't want my sugars to go out of range. And then I'll take a massive dose of insulin, and then I'll start roller coaster of insulin dosing and lows and highs, and that's a surefire way to throw off your blood sugar control and increase your A1C. Number 1 thing to do is not overreact. Pause before you make a decision. Tip number 7, Dextrose tabs are the ultimate tool. Now, what I mean by that, Dextrose tabs are basically a sugar tablet that have 4 grams of carbohydrate per serving. I think there's different brands all over the world, but the ones in Canada and the US, they're called Dextrose tabs, Dex4s actually. And they're absolutely brilliant for me. I've used them a lot in the last couple of years because you can take 1 tablet and I can tell you how much that will increase my blood sugar. And once you figure that out, you can figure out how to treat your low blood sugars. And what I've noticed back on the pump is you don't overtreat it. Dextrose tabs have helped me to treat blood sugars more effectively, basically. When I'm topping up my blood sugar level with one dextrose tab, I know, like I said, it'll raise it a certain amount. They're fantastic. I highly recommend everybody uses them. It prevents those roller coaster blood sugars and is number 8. I have 8? Yes, I have 8. Is dosing changes. I'm on insulin. I probably make more dosing changes than folks with type 2 diabetes, but as a type 1, you have to make dosing changes. I find I need a bit more insulin when I'm less active, for example. There's many reasons to change your dose of insulin. My mantra is to measure, monitor, and then I make the change. So 2024, I really made an effort to be less reactive with my insulin dose changes in order to keep my blood sugars more stable. Tip number 9 is to be proactive with dosing versus reactive. What I mean by that is if I'm going to take a dose of insulin, I ask myself the question, what will I be doing in the next 4 to 5 hours? Because that's typically the length of time the insulin dose is going to be in my system. So if I'm sitting down for a meal, I'll ask my girlfriend this all the time. Well, what are we doing in the next 4 hours? It gets a bit annoying, I'm sure. But the point is, I need to reduce my insulin or increase it. So if I'm going to be lazy for the next 4 hours, or I'm going to be sitting down watching Netflix, then I'm going to take either my standard dose or maybe a little bit more. If I'm going to be going for a 2-hour hike, then I'll reduce my dose to account for that hike. So that proactive thinking is absolutely crucial to blood sugar control. It prevents taking too much and then having those lows. And then when you start having lows, you have that rebound, you have the ups and downs and the roller coaster. Tip number 10 is I basically eat 3 standard meals a day. And when I say standard, what I mean is I eat 3 breakfast, lunch, dinner, or supper, wherever you are in the world. And I have the same amount of macronutrients. So I have the same amount of carbohydrate, same amount of protein. Those two are very important, and the same amount of fat. And by doing that, I'm able to match my insulin to that standard meal. Now, this may drive most people crazy. And the argument I get from people is, well, I don't want to live that way. It's too restrictive. And I am not encouraging anybody watching this to eat the way I eat. I'm just sharing that diabetes loves routine. By standardizing the amount of macros I have in each meal, I know the dose to take. And to me, it's a mental burden that I don't have to think about. And I'll get to a tip down below here so I can maintain this and do it over the long term, because I certainly couldn't do it 100% of the time. Let me know in the comments what type of diabetes you have, how you manage it, and please share some of your own tips. Tip number 11, if you're not getting the results you want in terms of your A1C, your blood sugars, how you feel, then personally reflect on that. I do all the time. I'm constantly changing my approach. This tip is basically something I do on a monthly basis to evaluate how this current thing is working, and then I'll make changes to make me feel better, to make me have more energy, to have better blood sugars, and constant improvement to keep my blood sugars good. If I listened to advice and just did what I was told, I probably wouldn't be here today. I've had diabetes for a long time. So I'm constantly trying to learn and advocate and make change and do what works for me. Tip number 12, intermittent fasting. Now, fasting is not a new concept in any stretch of the imagination, but it's something new to the diabetes world, and it's being researched on now. It is beneficial for diabetes overall. It reduces insulin resistance, basically makes you sensitive to the insulin you take, so you don't have to take as much, and the stuff you do take works really good and better, so it results in better blood sugar control. I personally started doing this about a year and a half ago, and I'd skip usually breakfast and I would fast. And by doing that, it allowed me to keep my blood sugars in range on my continuous glucose monitor way easier, because food is one of those things that if you start eating, your blood sugar goes up out of range and it eventually comes down usually, but it's just guaranteed 12-14 hours in range by extending that fasting state. Something really important that I do 3 times a week is fast. Tip number 13, which directly linked to the last tip, is not fasting on those days where I have to exercise and work out and box or whatever it is, because you need fuel. If you're an active person, intermittent fasting works on those days where you're not physically active. Tip number 14, meal planning just for grocery shopping and efficiency alone is crucial, but always looking through this in the lens of blood sugar control and diabetes tips. By meal planning, I know exactly the foods I am eating, right? I find that times that I do meal plan, the meals are more blood sugar friendly because I know exactly what the carb is in the foods. Another thing I forgot to mention, as promised, on tip number 10, with the standard meals that I eat in a day and this kind of relates to meal planning too. Food labels are often off by 30%. So what that means is if something on a food label says 100 grams of carb, could be 110, could be 130. So that to me was really key information to understand and learn about, because the higher the carb amount you eat, the more room there is for error. That's a tip I want to share. A bit shocking. Most people don't realize that governments are okay with this margin of error on our food labels. Tip number 15, figuring out those fast food hacks. My previous video I just did, I talk about fast food hacks, figuring out how to modify the foods at fast food restaurants that I really didn't want to give up just for convenience reasons. I'm busy. I'm a full-time single dad. I work many hours. I do YouTube videos. I'm active. Having that option to eat my low carb type of way at fast food restaurants was key. Tip number 16, I love coffee, but coffee does spike blood sugar. It increases your blood sugar. No other word. I've tried many techniques over the years, including quitting coffee to keep that blood sugar stable, but I now take a half a unit or a unit of insulin, depending on the type of coffee and the size of the coffee, to counteract that. It's not always 100%, but not willing to give up. You shouldn't. If you enjoy a particular dessert, figure out how much insulin to take to cover that dessert. Tip number 17, know that foods out there that we've been told don't cause blood sugar spike actually do. Pretty much everything you put in your mouth will increase your blood sugar. It's just a matter of testing and monitoring your CGM, if you have one, to determine what types of foods do to your blood sugar. I did a video on this that was quite popular. Secret sugar spike, and basically lettuce in large enough quantity will spike your blood sugar. Always keep that in mind. The only way to figure this out is to test. Number 18, which is my favorite tip personally, it's Indulgent. You can't maintain strict blood sugar control 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It's impossible. You'll go mentally insane. So I definitely have a good time when I go out on date night, which is usually every Saturday, and I eat wherever we go. I try all sorts of different foods, and I've done a series of videos, was the Insulin Worth It videos, where I share how I manage type 1 diabetes and insulin dosing with the foods we eat. You have to live. You have to enjoy your life. Tip number 19, eat for better blood sugars. What I mean by that is find out what works for you and then figure out a system so you can eat that way. There's folks that do well eating the standard American diet or Canadian diet, whatever you want to call it, the regular way of eating. They just have a system worked out that works for them. My daughter, she eats pretty much what she wants, and her A1C is pretty much the same as mine. I met a friend of my partner when we were visiting her hometown, and she's on a pump, and her pump's ringing off, and she's just living life. And I want to say, like, that's really awesome to see. You have to figure out what works for you and then do that. Find out what works for you and do it. And just figure out a way to keep your blood sugars controlled. And that requires a lot of data collection, analysis. And there you go. I eat low carb. That's where I've come to the conclusion is the best diet for me. Now, keep in mind, this is not medical advice. This is my experience. I am definitely not a doctor. Number 20 is kind of getting into the exercise realm of things, is figuring out a way to stay active on the job. If you have a desk job like I do have a stand-up desk, thank goodness, not everybody does. But what I've done recently is purchased a walking under the desk treadmill from Amazon. A lot of these things are fairly affordable now. If you wait for the deals, I got this one for like $207. It's 79% off. I walk for 30 minutes while I'm doing non-focus work, checking emails, that sort of thing. And then I walk after lunch as well. So I'm walking after breakfast, after lunch, increases sensitivity to insulin. And I've already noticed a difference. I'm sure my next A1C will be a lot better. There's other methods you can do at work. You can do squat, take your breaks to go for a walk if you can, because it's absolutely crucial to overall blood sugar control. Tip number 21, staying active as much as possible, doing things you enjoy doing. I enjoy a lot of physical activity, but not everybody does. So this is just a tip that's really important for longevity, bone health, insulin sensitivity, weight maintenance, all that stuff related to blood sugar. Keeping in mind that certain physical activities can actually cause your blood sugar to spike. If your blood sugar is a normal level and you hit the gym and you do high intensity weight training, high intensity boxing, martial arts, things like that, your blood sugar will spike if you're type 1 diabetic. So work that into your diabetes plan. Tip number 22 is been a tough one. I'm not going to lie. I'm going to be absolutely serious here. It's alcohol intake. I enjoy my wine. I do. And what I'm discovering this last couple years is, having a couple glasses of wine multiple times a week actually is most likely not really impacting my diabetes that badly, but it's one more variable to consider when dealing with blood sugars. Reducing the amount of alcohol, I noticed improvement and stabilization of my overall blood sugar profile. Tip number 23 is sleep. Sleep directly impacts blood sugar. If I don't sleep well, my sugars are so stubborn the next day. I have to take correction shots, which is when you take a shot of insulin to get your blood sugar down. Making a conscious effort to control the things you can regarding sleep, like no alcohol 2-3 hours before you go to bed, because alcohol prevents you from getting that deep sleep. Sleep is also really important because if you have type 2 diabetes, it can increase those stress hormones that cause insulin resistance, making weight loss really difficult because your body starts pumping out more insulin because insulin can't do what it should be doing in your body because of the resistance, right? So to bring it back into blood sugar control, number 24 is stress reduction. So stress is an overarching term, but as I just explained with sleep, being stressed out releases those stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, that cause increased glucose production in the body. It causes increased insulin resistance, so the sugar can't get where it needs, so it causes damage. So it does a whole whack of stuff to the body that we diabetics could do without. So stress reduction has been important, and I have a coach now through work who's been really helpful, and he constantly reminds me to focus on those things that only I can control, right? And that's been really helpful to sort of think about and meditate on, because by focusing on the things that I can control, I can't do anything about everything else. But I find things in that realm of control that I can do things about, and they often really help reduce stress and change my mindset. Keeping your stress in check will keep blood sugars well controlled. Which brings me to my last and final point, which I'm kind of excited to talk about, and that's dopamine and diabetes. I think there's a lot of hype on dopamine right now. Andrew Huberman did a huge podcast with this author here. There. Dopamine Nation, and this is a leading expert at Stanford University. It talks about dopamine as the motivation hormone and how it's completely being utilized in the wrong way right now. We get little dopamine spikes when we scroll our phone, for example, so it keeps us motivated to go back and get that fix. That's just one quick example. I'm curious to know if I detox, which is really common lingo now, to not scroll your phone, to have cold showers, to be uncomfortable, because that's the kind of dopamine the body needs. It's like a scale and balance. In the future, I will be doing a video on dopamine detox journey that I'm currently on right now, and the impact it's had on my blood sugar control. Please remember to subscribe and hit the notification button so you don't miss this dopamine video. I'm really excited to be making it. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.